Hi, it's Jessica Farrow from Halston Marketing on Remote Control Season 2.
Hi Jess, thanks for joining us for Season 2 of Remote Control. Great to have you here. Really looking forward to chatting about the white paper you produced with the International Association of Business Communicators. I think I'll just call them IABC, otherwise it's too much of a mouthful.
It is a bit of a mouthful, but thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So the full title, and correct me if I get this wrong, but The Changing Face of Crisis Comms, a COVID-19 Retrospective, a definitive account of the pioneering strategies implemented by the leading comms professionals at the heart of the UK's core industries.
Yep, that is correct. Again, a bit of a mouthful. I do apologise for these titles, but yeah, that's the white paper we are just finalising at the moment, and yeah, it's due to go out very soon.
Great. I was hoping you could just start by telling us a bit about the approach to the white paper, the interviews, and kind of who was involved, really.
Yeah, so obviously it is in association with the IABC. So it was a mixture of Halston Marketing and the network within the IABC. In terms of the research, it was a mixture of primary and secondary. So the first sort of section goes through the pandemic as a whole in terms of like a sector breakdown, understanding, the economic impacts, just major industry changes as a whole. And that research was kind of done. There's quite a lot of statistics about at the moment, and so the Office for National Statistics has loads of information. So we kind of delved into that a little bit and investigated it. And then the predominant focus is obviously these direct account from internal comms professionals. So these were either board members of the IABC or connections from our wider network that we have already. And we sort of outreach to them. We had this idea in mind, outreach to them, say, would you please let's get involved? We wanted to get this kind of first-hand perspective, because it's fair enough writing about this, but if it's, yes, we know about it, but we don't know as much as these senior professionals that are doing this day in, day out. So we kind of needed that.
Yeah.
And yeah, we were so thankful for kind of the good approach from everyone. They were so enthusiastic, happy to get involved. So we have really senior comms professionals from PPG, John Lewis, Waitrose, obviously, AXA. So it was just really nice to see how involved they wanted to get. And it was really good to kind of get that first-hand perspective from companies of that size, because they're dealing with thousands of employees, and also some of them actually have multiple international locations as well. So it was such a broad scope in that sense.
Yeah, it seems really wide-ranging with those companies that you mentioned, and good to hear that people were keen to be involved. Probably a little bit of catharsis. I imagine this has been one of the most stressful times of their careers, really, dealing with, like you say, thousands of people potentially spread across the world, and the crisis is, it's been everywhere, isn't it? So kind of, I imagine, very busy time for them all.
Oh yeah, I was surprised, because I did anticipate that some of them were probably too busy to even have the chance to step out of their day and kind of go through the interviews with us, because they're just non-stop at the moment. And obviously March was obviously their busiest time, but they're still very busy at the moment. And it was just, there was just so much going on for them, but it was great to see them getting involved with this.
Yeah. And one thing that I noticed in the kind of the introduction to the white paper is a couple of statements, and one was a quote actually from the Microsoft CEO, and they caught my eye because I work in the tech industry and the tech business. And so, the Microsoft CEO says, we saw 2 years worth of digital transformation in 2 months. I just think that's kind of quite mind-blowing, really, and maybe hasn't been such a huge thought or focus of the past 6 to 8 months, where there's been these huge changes in the business for people, but also the technology has kind of really had to move quickly in some businesses that perhaps weren't quite so modern. And KPMG as well, they talk about even in a recovery phase, whenever that may be, we can expect technology companies to remain in high demand for supplying the remote working environment. I think that's kind of really quite striking, that whilst it's going to have a really big impact on other industries, there would be an opportunity for maybe tech businesses, the digital side of things is really kind of coming to the fore in those two statements and quotes.
Yeah, and no, I love that quote as well. So that quote, I was on a webinar and it had a Microsoft team member that was kind of discussing some of the technologies and what they've had to do during this time. And she quoted that quote and I was like, that is just so perfect.
Yeah.
It just says it in one line, really. And it's very true that it simultaneously seem to have identified massive holes in these big companies' digitalization. Like, they've just realized that their systems are so legacy that they're not integrated at all. They have no sort of hybrid infrastructure where they could take their laptops and just leave the office. I mean, they were still plugged into the mainframe. And I was just like, that's just so old school. But you forget that these big companies have just been going for so long that actually there's not been that many changes. And at the same time, yeah, these tech companies are sort of run off their feet. I know we've got quite a few tech clients that this is one of their busiest times. And also, I think it was Laura from Fibre, who's one of the interviewees. She was talking about, obviously they do sort of like the fibre and the sort of infrastructure side behind that. And they are very busy, and they already have plans to continue this sort of level, because it's very much standard across many of these companies that we won't be returning fully back to the office in the same way. It's going to be a little bit of both, really. So we're still going to need that strong infrastructure to continue this. So some companies are just really, if you've got a technology that obviously aids remote working in any way, I think they will continue to kind of have like a really busy season.
Yeah, and it makes sense, I suppose, that those companies, tech companies, are rising to the challenge, where these big companies kind of need the extra support, and they've been forced to, I guess, evaluate how they can be flexible to continue working whilst people haven't been allowed in the offices and haven't been allowed in big groups. So yeah, interesting to see how that will continue as, I guess, guidelines and advice continues to change, really.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's quite interesting because quite a lot of these technology companies are quite startups or SMEs, and they're just so more flexible in the way that they work and the way that they can work than these massive companies. These massive companies, it is a struggle for them to digitalize their entire operations, and it would have normally taken them probably about 2 to 3 years. But if they're outsourcing to these really innovative tech companies, they just have the capability to just build something so much faster and implement faster. So there's been a lot of sort of outsourcing.
Oh, okay. So was that a bit of a theme that you saw through the interviews, was it?
Yeah, it's definitely something that we are starting to notice, that actually they've kind of just, implemented stuff really quickly, and actually got it from elsewhere, because they kind of just don't have the infrastructure already available, really.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, so I was reading through the white paper, and it's really fascinating to see the stories from major UK companies seeing their approach to crisis comms. It's not something that you always see from a white paper, those real actual examples, and during such a different time for everyone, it's been interesting to read those different stories. I was just wondering, thinking back to the interviews and thinking through the white paper, are there any that stood out in particular for you about their approach to crisis comms so far?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, they were all very interested to me. It was kind of really, I had so much fun interviewing and kind of understanding what all these people are doing. But for me personally, there were sort of two that really stood out. And I think the first one, again, this is Laura from Fibre, just because she did a simulation, and she was only one out of the interviews to do this. And I thought that was such a proactive way of doing things, in terms of like making sure their method would work for the official lockdown. So the internal comms team at City Fibre did like a business continuity exercise where they evaluated their plan that they already had in place for a viral outbreak, because quite a lot of these internal teams do have plans for obscure events.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, so some have, an earthquake has closed down one of their offices, you can't go into the office, or it's too snowy, so that's blocked off this office, or there's been a viral outbreak within this office, what do we need to do? So some of them already have these sort of plans, I guess, but obviously it's maybe just not to the same scale of what COVID is. So they kind of ran like a hypothetical scenario, and employees were receiving instructions like, you will be running a simulation today, we need to practice this. So, and then it was like, you need to pack up, leave your office, and see how it was only a small bubble of people. So like this particular bubble that they'd chosen for the simulation, they all had to pack up instantly, go home, start working from home that day. And they kind of wanted to see how that worked. Did it work effectively? Did everyone get the instructions in time? Was it effective? And actually they started to find that actually they were using emails, which wasn't the quickest way of getting hold of people, because some people set off really early to go to the gym or they bike in. So actually they don't check their work email until they get into work. So actually they never receive the email, whereas if it was a text, obviously it's something a lot more instant, and they would have got the information faster. So actually they ran a second simulation and they used the text instead. So they ran two before the final lockdown actually happened. But I thought that's quite an interesting way of really getting ahead of it and making sure when it is going to happen. Obviously you don't have so much time. This all happened within a space of 2 weeks, I think. But they really tried to be on it and make sure that, when we do this is going to be done right, and it's going to be done to the best that we can do it, basically, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really, really good approach. And to see such immediate learnings, or that the text was going to be more effective than emails to their work account, that makes, I guess, a whole difference to their future approach. That's really interesting. What was the other one that kind of stood out for you?
Yeah, so this would be sort of Lisa so she's the internal comms team member for John Lewis and Waitrose, their partnership. So this was most specifically to do with the Keeping Connected hub that they had created. So they basically, during lockdown, they created a central space that was purely dedicated to giving people, keeping people connected, engaged, and feeling supported. So it had like a company radio, virtual exercise classes, award ceremonies,
oh, wow.
So many different stuff. They tried to do so much stuff like virtually, and trying to like just keep that positivity, really. And obviously they are massive. They've got, quite a lot of the John Lewis team were furloughed, whereas obviously the Waitrose team were kind of running off their feet.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So it was like, two opposite ends of the spectrum. And there was making sure that even though everything's happening so differently, you still got like a place to be where you can keep connected, still keep informed, still feel like you're part of the business. And they took well-being very seriously and trying to keep people positive, which I thought was just quite a nice way of doing things. And I thought like it was so interesting that she was like, she did say that she was so excited to just try out all this different stuff. Like there wasn't anything stopping her trying out all these new things that they hadn't got to do before. So yeah, I thought that one was really interesting as well.
Yeah, that's kind of a totally different angle to it, isn't it? That's something new, but with the engagement in mind, as opposed to the crisis, this must change. It's trying to generate that positivity, like you said, and amongst kind of all the colleagues. And yeah, I love the idea of a company radio. That sounds really innovative. I like that.
Yeah, I thought that was a nice one as well. And it's definitely the only one that mentioned it. So I feel like they're kind of ahead of it at the moment. And it might be something that they can keep doing as well. Like it doesn't have to just be a lockdown thing.
Yeah, and it's a bit of a evolution of the company Spotify playlist, which, always causes arguments in the offices. So I can imagine the radio choice went down just as well.
Yeah, I would love it. Like if you just took over, like different employees taking it over for the day, and that they were running the radio that day with their playlist. I think that's great.
Yeah, I think you certainly find out some closet S Club 7 or Hearsay fans.
That'd be me.
Okay, so the next thing I wanted to touch on was um, from the interviews. Did you find that there was a specific medium or channel that proved most effective across the board?
Yeah, so there was a couple of discrepancies between them, but one of them that seemed to be quite popular was creating a central intranet. So these central intranets probably beforehand didn't have minimal views. Some of them didn't even have any before, but because there was just so many updates and so much information, they needed a place where to host all this information. So some of them were now receiving like 75,000 views in 1 week.
That's
Oh, they said,
quite an increase.
yeah. So like you think, I've probably never accessed a central internet before. Even when I've worked for these big companies, and I was like, I probably went on it, once, twice, and 75,000 in 1 week is just massive. And I think because it was so constant, like obviously there was government updates pretty much every single day, and more than a couple of times a day in obviously the first few weeks in March. So quite a lot of this time, if you can imagine getting emails sent to you every single time there's an update, or a text message every single time, it became very tedious very fast, and you'd probably find that engagement would go down because people have just probably fed up of receiving them. So what quite a lot of them tended to do was just actually send out one email with all the most important emails from that, most important updates from that day, and then link them back to the central intranet for more detailed information around the update. Just to sort of, I think it helped with the sort of engagement on that side, and just making sure people are updated, but you're also not overwhelming them, because I can imagine that if you got too many, some employers, it could feel quite overwhelming and stressful. So it was kind of just keeping that balance, I guess.
Yeah, you could totally imagine a deluge of emails being causing extra concern at a time that was already quite concerning, inside and outside of work. So it makes sense to develop the intranet in a way that would increase and improve the engagement across the board there. So interesting, because like you say, intranets, they're not always the most well visited or used, and certainly get a bad rep every now and again. But I think what does make sense is when there is central information that needs to be, I guess, either cascaded out quickly, having that one place where they all are makes total sense. Just wonder how many managed to stand up to the sudden interest from going from kind of maybe single or double digit visits to thousands or hundreds of thousands of visits. And I bet some of the IT teams were struggling in the background.
Oh yeah, I can imagine, because some of these percentages, like there's a few throughout the white paper of like the increases. Some of them are like 100% increase, or like just the numbers are insane of the views that they're getting. And can you imagine, just all of a sudden one day you've had to move every single person remote working, so your infrastructure is already under some serious pressure, and then you're getting this sort of viewage on these stuff, and I'm like, yeah, I can imagine the IT team were very stressed.
Yeah, I imagine that was a kind of an extra burden on that team, but one that was done their companies a world of good. I think kind of focusing on that then, so you mentioned the intranet was kind of a major similarity across most of the interviews. I was just wondering if there was other similarities, and whether you can almost pick and choose from some of the interviews to create a bit of a blueprint for future crisis comms, or is it not quite so straightforward?
I think there's definitely aspects that you can take and can be applied across the board. So something that I noticed was like quite quickly, obviously, like the crisis meetings, or the creating a chain of command. So quite a lot of them already had like a chain of command in place, which I thought was something that was very important, because as you can imagine, if you're in a crisis, you don't want to be sat there, oh, so who's going to do this? Or where's this? Who do we send this to? And it needs to already be there. Like it's just not an option. And a lot of them did have that sort of chain of command in place. Quite a lot of them already had a plan where, you know, they'd all meet certain dedicated team. They already had teams built up that included the internal comms, but also included certain managers from other departments, and they would all have a crisis meeting every single morning. And that sort of stuff was stuff that was already decided beforehand. And obviously, so as soon as the crisis comes into place, everyone knows, yes, I need to be involved with this specific thing. That is my responsibility. It was already there, which I thought was something that it needs to happen. I think this one thing, obviously no crisis is ever the same, and I feel like there was something quite interesting with this one where they did each step outside of the box in terms of like the mediums and the approaches that they took. I think there's got to be that basis there, but you can't always stick to the rule books. Like, yes, you may have this crisis plan already in place to do with this particular scenario, but yes, it applies in certain sense, but actually this scenario is slightly different. It just doesn't quite fit. And you have to be able to adapt to what is happening in that situation, not be afraid to try new mediums, because like I don't think, especially in this situation, no one has ever dealt with it before. I don't think anyone's going to be like, well, you use this and we don't like this. Like, you've kind of got to go with it. So like obviously the video calls, the yammers, the keeping connected hubs, all that sort of stuff, like they all try to different mediums, different messaging as well that they probably don't usually do. And I feel like it was quite good that they'd all really took the time to understand what was going off at the moment, and what do we actually need to adapt, and what can we try as well. And I think there's always going to be a sense of like testing, trialing at every time, but I think it was important that every single one of them did get feedback forms from the employees. So every single one of these are currently ongoing or have done feedback forms, just to understand how the employees felt about the approach they took. So, and if they have any preferences for the future. So that'll be really helpful for that future, you know, that blueprint of any other crises and any other crisis plans. You've kind of got a basis there where you know what your employee base preferred.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was actually going to ask about management and what have been put in place from some of the companies that you've spoken to. So interesting to hear about the feedback forms and asking for preferences. That's a good way of going beyond just measuring what happened and looking forward to, okay, that's what we did, but what could we do differently, or what did you like from what's gone on? So that's an interesting approach.
Yeah, I know, and I feel like it's so important to understand that, because if you were doing something completely that actually most of your employee base did not actually like that way of doing things, and you didn't take the time to actually understand that is something that's then going to you're going to continue to do it maybe in another crisis in the future. And actually, if you did took that time to understand that, you will have a better and more refined plan for the future.
Yeah, totally. I think anything building on what's gone well, and even building on what's gone wrong or not so well in the past, gives you a much better platform to do something even better. Well, hopefully not next time, but
don't want another one, but
let's not jinx it. So we talked about similarities. I'm just wondering what you saw as the most significant differences between some of the companies, and just kind of would like to get your thoughts on why you think they exist, really.
Yeah, so I think the one that's the sort of industries that's like stood out a little bit more in their approach was sort of the industrial industries. So a few of the people we interviewed, like PPG and Johnson Matthey's, are obviously manufacturers, very big manufacturers internationally. So they have hundreds of plants aside from offices internationally. So they, in that aspect, they can't just pack up and leave and go work from home. That's just not an option. Like, these plants are dealing with seriously toxic, hazardous chemicals. You can't just leave.
Can't take those home.
Can't take them home. Yeah. So in that sense, they had to take a really different approach and be like, look, we appreciate this is a difficult time. Like, this is, something we've never had to deal with. We're going to have to. So the guys at Johnson Matthey, he was explaining that for every plant, there is about 120 steps that need to be taken place to shut down a plant safely. So it's not just, a few switch off the lights. Like, you have to go in one by one and make sure every single one of those steps has been done correctly.
Mm-hmm.
And to do so, they had to, obviously, it's going to take a little bit longer because they can't have the full workforce in there either. So they had to go down to a skeleton staff, get them in certain rotas to make sure this shutdown was happening. And stuff like that, where actually they were still using managers to relay the messaging. They still using paper documentation in the sites because sometimes it was still the easiest way to get hold of them. Because quite a lot of them, obviously, they're not on the laptops and not on the computers all day. Like, they don't have that much access to it. They probably might have access like once a day. Yeah. So it's a very different way that they had to do things. And some of these plants still had to work the entire way anyway. Like, some of them didn't even shut down. So some of them were doing like food packaging coatings. So as you can imagine, with all the buyout of the stores, they were in quite high demand. So ones like that, they were still having to continue throughout. So yeah, it was a very different. They were sort of the most different in the sort of methods that they were using, because the sort of work from home, the video calls, the emails, texts, that just wouldn't work because they don't have access to that when they're in the manufacturing site. So they had to go about things a little bit differently.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think it actually touches on something that I covered in an episode from season 1, where I spoke to Jenny Field, who'd done some research around engaging remote workers, and that very much focused on kind of frontline staff in retail and manufacturing that don't have access to emails, the entire time that they're at work, and looking at how kind of communication best works for them. So interesting that it's kind of come up again here in a different scenario, but something that, I guess companies in those industries and sectors were really focused on and may have found challenging. I suppose the digital transformation that Microsoft talked about definitely has its benefits, but it, from my mind, can't be applied blanket across everyone. And there's some good examples that you just kind of highlighted, really.
Yeah, 100%. Like, as much as I feel like a focus for so many of them will be about the digitalization, the remote way of sending things, and everyone just going home. But quite a lot of these, and a few of these, are infrastructure, they're manufacturing. Like, they had to keep working. That wasn't that just wasn't an option. So it's very much, they had to sit there and maybe work 2 separate plans for the 2 separate types that they were working with. So it was quite interesting to see how they were dealing with that.
Yeah, that's a good point. Even within the same company, there'd be kind of maybe more office-based people that potentially could work from home, or compared with people who were in the manufacturing sites. So I think we covered quite a lot of what's happened so far in 2020 from your interviews. I think one part of it that really interested me was kind of predictions for their future strategies and how that would work. And now there's some common themes that came up, and I picked up there was a focus on success stories, exit planning, and remote working. I'm just wondering how you saw these 3 themes in particular shaping the internal comms plans for the companies you interviewed and companies as a whole, really.
Yeah, so I think for the internal comms team, there's going to have to be a real big thought around how they're going to adapt their plans to meet this sort of new hybrid working model. So you'll have some employees still working from home, you'll have some in the office. So are you going to do double communication? Are you going to, find a platform that works across the board, and kind of developing those plans to be very aware that this isn't something that's just everyone's going back no, everyone's not going back. As much as we would love to, it's going to be a bit of a while. So I would say for like the next 6 months, and these were sort of, I asked like predictions for the next 6 months, a year, they're very much thinking on remote working will still be a common theme, because it will be a choice as well, probably for many employees.
Yep.
So yeah, just looking into the mediums they're going to use and kind of understanding which will remain prevalent, which maybe you might have to change to kind of appreciate that quite a lot, some people are coming back to the office, and making sure there's no gaps essentially between the two. Because yes, we could probably assume that, oh yeah, they're in the office, they're going to tell their colleague. Are they? So like, you need to make sure you're just making sure everyone is still getting the same communication, the same messaging, and it's still kind of everyone's working to the same board, I guess. And in terms of success stories, this is something that was a huge focus, just across them all really. And there was in particular like well-being, because I think quite a lot of them had really taken a lot more consideration around being a bit more empathetic and supportive, which is maybe something that the employees have not really seen so much from a company perspective. Like you maybe had a mental health first aider or someone to go to if you needed support, but there wasn't just like a blanket support for everyone, I guess. Whereas this was like, okay, everyone's sort of in a difficult situation right now, we need to really think about this. So there was a lot of focus of it, actually, like, we need to make sure everyone's okay, because even though everyone might be dealing with something different, everyone might be struggling in their own way. So I think, and a lot of them to kind of keep people positive and that sort of messaging going out, are looking for these stories. And there were some lovely ones, people using 3D printers to make obviously masks for the NHS. There was loads of like positive stories of like the employees themselves, so that like quite a lot of the companies were asking employees to send them really nice stories and positive stories, because they want to relay this positive messaging out to everyone else, and say, oh look, one of our employees is doing this amazing thing, like we want to let you all know about it, and kind of keep that going, because I mean, we keep being threatened with a second lockdown. So I guess it feels a little bit again at the moment like it's a bit uncertain. We're not quite sure what's going to happen for the winter. And these plans should still kind of keep that positivity going.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to try and keep a kind of a sense of community, isn't it, amongst the colleagues and employees, to still share stories about what people are doing, because you'd get that in an office. You'd have the general catch up chats and sharing good news. So it's good to see companies taking that on board, that just because people aren't sat next to each other, they still want to kind of hear the good news stories that are going on. So that's encouraging, and I think that bears out over what you see on LinkedIn, certain news stories as well. I've seen from Salesforce that they're giving their employees that are parents are getting some extra kind of paid leave this year, which I think, being a parent myself sounds great, but I think it needs that kind of employee culture, company culture, for everyone to be supportive of that. I could imagine that could put some people who aren't parents put their noses out of joint a little bit, but I think if you've got a supportive culture, it's not that anyone's losing anything, it's that Salesforce actually trying to help people that perhaps need that extra bit of support, and it's maybe just a different way of looking at it from that. So I thought that was a really good example of a company, like you say, being proactive with the support, as opposed to just having something there when you need it. They were actually going out and doing something to keep their employees, I guess, so they didn't have to worry about something else, as well as the pandemic that's kind of still with us, really.
Yeah, 100%. And I feel like quite a lot of these companies, they're quite big companies. You hear the name, but it doesn't have like a a feeling associated with it. And I guess this sort of positivity and this sort of well-being focus and looking after the employees kind of makes it feel like a nice person that's looking after you, making sure you're okay. And it kind of gives a person behind the company, and quite a lot of the CEOs were getting involved with like video calls, you know, explaining what was going off in their home and giving a bit of insight into what they're dealing with. And I thought that was quite nice as well, just to really put a face to a company. And there's quite a lot of that. And yeah, I think it's definitely something that a lot of them are focusing on, of trying to think of ways of how they can help people. But it'll be the internal comms team's job to make sure it's just being relayed in the right way. But yeah, no, it was very good to sort of see that.
Yeah, a great point about the company putting the support there, but yeah, huge focus on the internal comms team to make sure it comes across in the right way to the right people and is explained nice and clearly. Because yeah, there's, you know, certain pockets of, I think ambiguity can breed kind of a bit of discontent sometimes with things like that. But yeah, great focus for the internal comms team there, I suppose.
Yeah.
So I've got some controversial answers to this next question in season 1, but you don't need to feel any pressure. It's pretty much a judgment-free zone. And I just thought, you know, the podcast is called Remote Control. Everyone has been binging Netflix, Amazon Prime over lockdown. So what have you been watching, and what would you recommend?
Oh, so I am a terrible binge watcher. I watch so much Netflix and Amazon. It shouldn't be normal.
You're the perfect person to ask the question of then.
Yeah, so at the minute, so I've been binge watching a lot of Hannibal on Netflix. I love that. Kind of one I've been going back to. I've also been watching The Boys on Amazon Prime. But I've made the rookie error of starting the first season just as the second season is coming out, which is so stupid because now all the adverts are popping up and I have to avoid them. Like, oh no, don't ruin it for me. So I need to really quickly watch the first season, so now I don't feel the pressure to like avoid all adverts.
Yeah, you want to make sure all the characters in the first season are in the second season advert or something like that.
Yeah, I was like, oh no, it's gone. So that's just, it's a bit of a weird one really. So it's like a superhero, but the superheroes are actually the bad guys, which is kind of nice. I do watch my Avengers and stuff like that, but it is kind of nice to see a bit of a different one.
Yeah.
And then this is going to sound crazy. You're going to judge me for this one. I know you say you're not, but you're going to. So last night I actually watched This Is Paris, you know, the YouTube original around Paris Hilton. Yeah. I actually watched that last night because I was just, the curiosity got the better of me and I needed to know what was going off.
This episode was going so well as well.
I know. I've just ruined it, hello.
I'll cut that from the final edit, don't worry.
Okay. No. It was all right actually, like, because she does annoy me with her baby voice and stuff like that, but I always think she's obviously made so much money and has so much business. I'm like, she can't be dumb. She's not dumb. Yeah. She's very smart. She knows exactly what she's doing, and I kind of wanted to see how she kind of does that. It was kind of nice to see like the version of her that it's not the baby voice, it's not the dumb blonde, it's not she's like a completely different person, and she's just been playing a character for like 30 years, which must be so annoying.
Yeah.
Like, but yeah, I was actually more impressed by him than I thought I would be. But I have to watch these things when I just see him. I'm like, I just need to know now.
Yeah. Oh, quite the departure from Hannibal and Boys to Paris Hilton.
Like, if you look through my history of watching TV, it's just the most obscure thing because it goes from one extreme to the complete other. But I kind of like that because you've got all your serious ones and your drama ones, and you've just got to mix it in with a bit of just weird comedy.
Yeah, definitely needs some light entertainment viewings, otherwise it can become a bit too much, can't it?
Yeah, you've got to have a bit of fun.
Yeah. Okay, well, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast, Jess. Just obviously before we sign off, where can people get a copy of the white paper from?
So the white paper is available on our website. So if you just go onto our website, there's a white paper section, and you're able to just download it free on there.
Fantastic. Right, well, I'll make sure I include a link in the episode notes so people can get to it. Just left for me to say thanks so much. Great way to kick off season 2.
All right. No, thank you so much for having me. It's been so much fun.
Remote Control, an internal comms podcast by Stream Go.